Hi everyone, welcome back to Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines. I'm your host, David Thompson. Today, it's my privilege to be joined by Dr. Allen Guelzo, the Henry R. Luce Professor of the Civil War era, as well as the Director of Civil War Studies at Gettysburg College. And we're talking today with Dr. Guelzo about his latest work, Gettysburg, The Last Invasion, now out with Alfred A. Knopf. So Dr. Guelzo, thanks so much for joining us today.
Pleasure to be with you, David.
Now, people hear about the Battle of Gettysburg, and there are no shortage of works out there that tackle this very, very important battle from the war. What inspired you to take on this project, knowing that there's so much out there already?
Partly because of the same reason that Mallory gave to the New York papers when they asked him why he wanted to climb Mount Everest, because it's there. And in a literal sense, it's there because I live and work here, so I'm thick and thin with the Battle of Gettysburg all around me all the time. But ultimately, I wanted to say something about Gettysburg because I think that the story of the Battle of Gettysburg had settled down into a number of very conventional ruts. And I wanted to climb out of the ruts and take a look around at the larger road and maybe the meadows on either side of the road and the ruts. And in doing so, you do find out some very extraordinary things that depart rather significantly from the, shall we say, accepted understanding of what the Battle of Gettysburg was all about.
Now, when you're dealing with something of this scope, when it comes to source material, that obviously can be a little tricky. So how did you yourself decide, what might you include, what might be excluded? Because I think you could drive yourself crazy if you try to incorporate every single thing out there on the battle itself.
Well, let's say that having a sabbatical year at Princeton helped. And I suppose I did it the way I go at most of these things, and that is I simply pile up lots and lots of things to look at and go at them with a will. I don't know if I have a more sophisticated way of doing it, but I suppose that's the way I've always been doing it. There's the target. Go at it through as much forest as you have to tramp through. And in the course of things, you generally do learn to figure out reasonably quickly that when you're looking at a particular source, whether it really is going to be of value, whether it's really going to yield you the time and the effort that you're planning to put into it, and whether there is really going to be something important said there. There is a lot of repetition. There is a lot of hashing over in Gettysburg. And in fact, there's layers upon layers upon layers of things where people think they're quoting an original source, only to find out that that original source really got it from another original source, maybe 2 or 3 times removed. In the Gettysburg literature, you can almost create a genealogy of certain comments, sentences, things that were said, and track them back through a variety of histories, and get surprised by where they originally emerged from.
I think one of the most interesting things you pointed out at the beginning of the work is concept of time and how, what was 1115 to so many different people? The people of Gettysburg, it meant one thing. Amongst the people of Gettysburg, it meant one thing. Between the armies, within the armies, and I think you stress that well. So I think that's a shining example there where source material is going to lead you in many different directions with something just as simple as time.
Well, in the 19th century, time is a much more fluid quantity, simply because the means of measuring it are much, much less exact than we have today. Time for us is something that we bump into all over. We look at the bottom right-hand corner of our computer screens. There's the time. Watches, clocks, things in public places. We have time zones. We have changes of time. None of this existed in the 19th century. Everything is really timed, if it's timed at all, to how things appear in terms of the normal movement of daylight. Even town clocks, there's really no way to synchronize time in certain towns with time in other towns. It really has to be a very hit and miss kind of thing. Now, if that's the case under peaceful conditions, what is it like for soldiers who are on the battlefield, who are trying, under the most stressful imaginable conditions, to estimate what time it is, then adding to the fact that, of course, in the middle of battle, you're dealing with these black powder weapons that kick out these fog banks of smoke some of them so thick that it almost obscures the sunlight. Then, what kind of a situation are you in for estimating the time? So in many respects, trying to peg particular times at Gettysburg is a very dicey affair, just as it was a very dicey affair for the people who were there at that moment.
Now, one of perhaps the most interesting things that caught my eye, and I must give credit as well to another Civil War Monitor contributor, Kevin Levin, who brought it to my attention as well, is that you tell us right from the beginning, if you want to compare this, when you're talking about total war or something, forget the Western Front of World War I. We need to come back into the 19th century. And I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more. Are we too narrow-minded in how we look at this war in terms of really shutting out anything global in terms of warfare itself? And are there ramifications from that, I guess?
There is a way in which ideas about American exceptionalism have attached themselves very strongly to the American Civil War. And we interpret our war, we research our war, almost entirely as though it was a provincial affair and nothing could be learned from, nothing could be connected to anything that was happening anywhere else. That would have come as a big surprise to the people actually involved in the American Civil War. The fact is that we can understand our Civil War a whole lot better by seeing it laid down parallel to European conflicts in the middle of the 19th century, such as the Crimean War of 1854 to 56, the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857 to 58, then the North Italian War in 1859, and followed even during the Civil War by the Schleswig-Holstein War of 1864. All of this is going on while our Civil War is going on, with more or less the same weaponry and reading the same kind of books and accounts about warfare that are being read in other places. In fact, you can look at Gettysburg and ask the question about something, for instance, like Pickett's Charge. Where did Lee get the idea for Pickett's Charge? It seems suicidal to send wave upon wave of Confederate infantry across almost a mile of open ground. Who would ever have thought such a thing? Well, someone in 1863 had only to cast their mind back 9 years to the Battle of the Alma in the Crimean War, where Lord Raglan takes 2 divisions of English infantry and sends that across 2 miles of open ground broken by the River Alma. Well, the river, it was more like over a large drainage ditch, but it still broke things up the same way the ditches at Fredericksburg did. Nevertheless, Raglan scored a tremendous success against Russian artillery and Russian infantry, so much so that if Raglan had followed up the Alma at all vigorously, he could have marched into a virtually undefended Sevastopol, and that would have been the end of that campaign. So, just thinking in terms of what was happening in an event as close as the Crimean War suddenly makes Pickett's Charge seem a whole lot more reasonable and a whole lot more doable in terms of the probability of its success.
Now, you had mentioned trying to get out of some of these Gettysburg ruts, so to speak. I don't want you to give away too much of the book for some of the readers out there, but could you offer perhaps a hint of maybe a few of the directions that you go in that you think you're perhaps righting wrong, or just offering some clarification on what many people have just kind of taken as gospel, if you will, but couldn't be further from the truth?
Well, one thing certainly that I think will be seen as distinctive about this book is the role that I discern in politics in both of the armies. This was a political war, very much a political war. No surprise then that the armies that marched to battle in this war are themselves carrying with them all the evidences of political dissension that are reflected in the civilian life back home. In the Army of the Potomac, for instance, there had been political dissension from the very foundation of the Army under George McClellan. It was no secret to anybody in 1862 that George McClellan certainly did not see eye to eye with Abraham Lincoln in terms of war policy, or much else in the way of policy for that matter. And McClellan's famous Harrison Landing letter in July of 1862 probably takes a Union Army commander as close to outright insubordination to his civilian commander-in-chief as any American military officer has ever been. Well, McClellan, of course, is off the scene by the time we get to Gettysburg. Off the scene, yes, but not off the sidelines. In fact, when Joseph Hooker is relieved of command of the Army of the Potomac, just about everybody in the Army fully expects that McClellan is going to be put back into command for this emergency, just as he had been put back in command before Antietam for an emergency. In fact, when the news of George Meade's appointment settles in instead, most people assume that Meade is simply a holding point for George McClellan until McClellan can catch up with the Army. And Meade himself was very much in the McClellanite camp. The upper command echelons of the Army of the Potomac were thus very bitterly divided politically. And you can almost sort out the 7 infantry corps of the Army of the Potomac according to their political allegiances. You have at one end the 11th Corps, certainly very Republican and abolitionist under Oliver Otis Howard. Then you also have the 3rd Corps, which is commanded by Dan Sickles, a war Democrat. All right, a Democrat, yes, but one very committed to the re-election of Abraham Lincoln. And one of the division commanders in that corps, David Bell Birney, very foremost abolitionist. At the other extreme, you have the most McClellanite and Democratic formations in the Army. You have, for instance, the 2nd Corps under Winfield Hancock, and then you have the 6th Corps under Uncle John Sedgwick. Sedgwick, of course, was later on in 1863 going to put himself right in the administration's crosshairs by trying to raise a fund to erect a soldier's monument to George McClellan. So given this kind of political division, it's not entirely a surprise that the politics will slump over into the military decision-making. And to the extent that George Meade identifies himself with McClellan, which he does, then a lot of Meade's decision-making at Gettysburg is going to have political overtones, and in one case, the case of planting Dan Sickles off on the left flank and then ignoring him, that almost costs Meade the battle.
Now, when people talk about works on the Battle of Gettysburg, I think Edwin Coddington's book is probably one of the first that really comes to mind for many. In your opinion, do you think it's fair to try and compare kind of great overall works? We know with so much with Gettysburg, people focus on a day or even just a small portion of the battle. But if you're looking at kind of those general overviews of the battle or the campaign, is it fair to try and kind of retrospectively put everybody in line with Coddington? And if this is better, this is different, kind of how do you come down on that?
Well, Dave, there's no question that Edwin Coddington's Gettysburg campaign book is the gold standard. It is a very conventional kind of military history. It is General A moved here, General B moved there. Division X moved here, Division Y moved there. It's supported by excellent maps, and it is enormously thorough, and I should add too, judicious in a lot of its judgments. Coddington worked very hard to be guided by the best sources possible, the best manuscript sources. A case in point is his treatment of Jeb Stuart's return from his great joyride on the late afternoon and evening of July 2nd. So many books about Gettysburg, and of course the movie Gettysburg, portray a tremendous confrontation between Lee and Stuart. Coddington contains nothing of that. And the answer is in his footnotes. He simply makes allusion to one letter, and the reason for that is that Coddington really doesn't think that that confrontation happened. Now, he doesn't bang the drum about it terribly loudly, but if he did not have good source material, he would not venture out and try to say something, no matter how much it had entered into the Gettysburg lore. So Coddington is a very, very powerful source to rely upon. At the same time, Coddington is very, very conventional too, and sometimes a trifle plodding. He can be quite a lot to get through. When I assign Coddington in my classes, I usually space him out over 3 weeks because he is a lot to plow through. I suppose I would distinguish myself from Coddington on several points. One is that certainly the political aspect that I look at in Gettysburg, The Last Invasion, scarcely enters into Coddington's frame of reference. Another aspect of this is our treatments of George Meade. Meade is very much the hero of the story in Coddington's book. I'm less enamored of Meade. My reading on George Meade is that the Battle of Gettysburg was more lost by Robert E. Lee than won by George G. Meade. And this is not to say that I demean George Meade, but on the other hand, he does not exactly have the most distinguished track record, even after Gettysburg. It's not because he lacked competence or courage. It's simply because he was not a great general. Many people seem to assume that because Meade won at Gettysburg and Lee lost, that somehow Meade must be the peer or maybe even the superior of Lee. Well, that's a speculative conclusion to draw. That's not necessarily the case. Great commanders can sometimes make great mistakes that ordinary commanders are able to take advantage of. And in large measure, that is what I think happened at Gettysburg. That distances me a good deal from Coddington. Above all, I think I'm looking in Gettysburg, the Last Invasion, for a sense of the texture of the experience of the battle, much more than just diagramming how one part of an army moved against another part. I'm interested in what the battlefield looked like, what the soldiers looked like, what they saw, what they heard, what they smelled even. I'm trying to create something close to what John Keegan might have called a face of battle for Gettysburg. Keegan made a deep impression on me in the mid-'70s when I first encountered his book, The Face of Battle. And that has remained with me. And I think there's a very strong sense in which The Face of Battle is really one of the hidden partners or silent partners in the writing of Gettysburg, the Last Invasion. And that sense, that concentration, that focus on the soldier's experience is, I think, the most important level on which Coddington and I are really pursuing a different kind of book. That much said, Coddington and I do agree that the Union won the Battle of Gettysburg.
Well, finally, Dr. Guelzo, Gettysburg, I think, more so than certainly any other Civil War battle, has a special connection, I think, with the American people, be it kind of casual fans of the war, those that are interested in it, as well as serious scholars. And moving into this summer with the 150th anniversary of the battle, what is it about the Battle of Gettysburg that, I guess, tugs at us as an American populace?
Several things. One is that it really was a very important battle. Some people ask me, do I think that Gettysburg was the decisive battle of the war? Well, not really, because after all, the war does go on for another 21 months. And some real fault does get found with George Meade for not having closed in and finished off Robert E. Lee before he was able to escape across the Potomac River. But the sense that somehow the Army of the Potomac had turned a corner, that after this long string of humiliating defeats it had endured, suddenly it could turn and win a clear-cut victory over the Army of Northern Virginia. That was a tremendous moment for Northern morale, especially coming as it did the same weekend as the surrender of Vicksburg to Ulysses Grant in the West. And then another factor enters in here, and that is the drama of the battle. This is not a battle so static that nothing happens except waves of one side's infantry dashing themselves against the defended positions of another. That might describe Fredericksburg. Gettysburg is different. Gettysburg is a series of only loosely connected actions that are filled with last-minute dramas, people showing up at the right moment on their own initiative, calling shots as best they can see them at the moment. It's so touch and go all the way through, right up until the very end. Gettysburg is, as Wellington said about Waterloo, a near-run thing. But the final thing I think that puts the halo around Gettysburg is Abraham Lincoln. It is a rare time that Lincoln ever left Washington during the Civil War. But he comes to Gettysburg in November of 1863 because Gettysburg really has come to mean something to him. It's come to mean the possibility, as he says in September, that peace is not so far off as we might have thought. It also means for him something symbolic, that Gettysburg should occur so close to the 4th of July. The 4th of July is sacred to Lincoln because it's the Declaration of Independence. And for Lincoln, the Declaration of Independence is a kind of secular scripture. And he makes this connection when he talks about how on the 4th of July, 1776, 7 years ago, we adopted this proposition. We embraced this proposition that all men are created equal and founded the nation on it. The fact that Gettysburg occurs so close to that, against the forces of people who denied that all men were created equal. For him, it was like Gettysburg was a sign in the heavens. And that draws him to the dedication ceremonies at the cemetery here in November, where he utters what are quite possibly the most eloquent 272 words in American history, if not in the English language itself. And it articulates for him how important, how symbolic Gettysburg was. It was such a tremendous sacrifice by very ordinary people in the name of democracy. That should inspire everyone around. And I think this applies as much to our day as it did to the people in Lincoln's day, to take increased devotion for that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That speech resonates with Americans to this day. We read it even at 9/11. And the fact that that is connected with Gettysburg, I think, is the final piece in making Gettysburg to be our most hallowed ground.
Well said, Dr. Guelzo. Well, thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to speak with us. Again, the book is Gettysburg, The Last Invasion, now out. For those who think they know all about Gettysburg, you don't. Get out there, pick up this book. It's a fantastic read. It's unbelievably well written. There's no other way to say it. It's just simply fantastic, and I advise everyone to pick it up and look through it, and you're going to see a different battle by taking a look at it. So again, thank you so much, Dr. Guelzo. Hope to have you back on again in the future.
You bet, Dave.